Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Gen Research Jazz Education in Research and Practice panel. And I have a very esteemed group of scholars with me that will share with you in a minute a lot of information on how to do research, a lot of important details. I also have a very long list of questions from everybody on the topics we're talking about, so we will definitely make an attempt to get to those. And what I would like to do is start, we will use a PowerPoint, and if you look in the Facebook Live description, there is a PowerPoint link. So you could follow along, and you can also check on the links that are on this PowerPoint. So I just wanted to show my face at the beginning, but I will share my screen now. And from now on, you will just hear my voice, and we will go through some of the PowerPoint with the links, and we'll attempt to answer the questions. So here comes the sharing, and I will start the presentation. And here it is. So the Gen Research Panel is something that I founded several years ago as a platform for all of us who do any inquiries to network and work together. And so for the panel today, I have four of my very esteemed colleagues. I have Dr. Martin Norgaard from Georgia State University. I have Dr. Harry Price from Kennesaw State, John Edward Hasse, curator of American Music Emeritus from the Smithsonian Institute, and Louise Porter, also from Rutgers, as of this point, happily retired and playing jazz piano. And first, I want to start out some of the opportunities that we have and answer some of the questions before I turn it over to my colleagues. And one of the really important opportunities that we have is a research fellowship. And this research, I had a lot of questions about it. This research fellowship is one a year. It is for $5,000 and also an additional $1,000 travel money. And it is awarded to a project, and the range of projects is very wide. We can go from, there's not a limitation or specification, but the important thing is that it uses the resources of the Smithsonian Institute in some way, and John Hasse can tell you how endless the resources are there. And the other important aspect is that there are presentations at the Smithsonian and at the Gen Conference. The application deadline is in September, middle September, and there is links and to more information on that. So that's the research fellowship. Here's an overview of some of the projects that we have funded so far. 2015 was Catherine Williams from the University of Plymouth on looking at Duke Ellington in a new light. 2016 was Christina Patuelli. She has a project called Network Jazz, which is a database mining. 2017 was Kimberly Teal at the University of Arkansas, and she looked at the Duke Ellington Orchestra on the topic of healing sounds. 2018 was Alana Radecki, who looked at some of the tap dancers in relation to the swing era. And our current fellow is Jasna Jovicevic from the University of Belgrade, and she's looking at the representation of jazz women in media. So much on the fellowships. For the conference, submissions are open right now, has been extended to May 31st. It only takes an abstract of about 300 words of something, a project that you'd like to present. Usually presentations are 25 minutes, including question and answer. There's also the opportunity for a 2-hour poster presentation session, which is actually a wonderful opportunity to share. And everybody who submits should check both boxes, because A, you have a higher percentage of getting your proposal accepted, and B, those poster presentations have 2 hours where you can interface with people, and it's very popular usually, and you can explain, and it's a much better opportunity to share a project. The process is, it goes through several reviewers, there'll be ratings on the proposal, and then they'll announce the notifications July, August, I believe. The conference will be January 6th to 9 in Louisville next year. And the third big opportunity is our journal, Jazz Education in Research and Practice. So we have the first edition out. We're just completing the second edition, and we extended the submission deadlines for 2 weeks. So it's open until May 18. Again, there's a wide range of topics that we're exploring in this journal. And there's also a wide range of types of submissions that can go in. If you look close here, it can be anything from full-length articles to research studies to smaller case studies. We're also open to reflective essays on a more philosophical type of topic, on a type of approach, literature reviews on really looking at all the work that has been done in a specific area. Quick hits is usually something where somebody just shares a special approach that they have been using that's been working, and that can be shared in a short little format, and also book reviews. So there's a lot of options, and I had a lot of questions on the submissions. Some were asking if there's a way to be a columnist, or if there's a way to be a paid contributors. So this is an academic journal. This is not a magazine like Downbeat where you can write paid articles. This is for academic work, and there's no reimbursement for articles. Also, some have been asking about the peer-reviewed process, what that means. So let me just explain that for a second. So double-blind peer-reviewed is the process that this journal goes through. And what this means is that once the article comes in, it'll go through 3 reviewers, and neither the reviewers nor the author will know each other. There's no identifiers, and the reviewers will provide very detailed feedback on the article. So it's actually a really wonderful process to learn more about what works, what the writing process, to getting feedback from experts in the field. And the reason this is important is A, for the feedback, B, of course, to make sure that what was submitted, the methods and the results in the writing is solid and is correct and is vetted. And of course, everybody who is in academia and needs to get promoted, needs to get tenure, this is also the way to get writing credentials that count towards tenure and help you get that. Plus, you get acknowledged in the field for your work and what you do. So here is the link. Again, you have the PowerPoint in the Facebook Live page. You can click on it. You can find it. This is where you can actually order it for your library and for your school, which everybody should have in their library. So go ahead and do that for the first volume and get your subscription. And we'll make sure we'll also have the link to submit in there soon. So I'm going to turn it over now to Harry Price.
Martin Norgaard.
To Martin Norgaard to walk us through a lot of the basics of research. Martin does incredible research, and I hope you'll share about that a little bit and about your work and lead us through this process. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Monica. It's a really pleasure to be part of this panel. Thanks for having me. So talking about research for 5 minutes, of course, is limited. I went ahead and put a definition up there so that we can all agree on what it is that we are talking about. So, and then I have 2 particular issues that are very important and are important to me, and issues that came up as I was looking. So I was one of the reviewers for the journal. In the journal, there's a list of who were reviewers, but you don't know who looked at what, of course, for the article. As Monica said, it was double blind, but you do know who the reviewers are. And I was one of the reviewers, so some of the comments here today is based on that. So anyway, so research, according to a dictionary, is a systematic investigation into and study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and to reach new conclusions. And I think we all now wondering in this very strange world we're living in, what really is research and what is just opinion, and sometimes it's hard to see. Switch to the next slide if you could, Monica. So my first example here is a study I did for my dissertation as a grad student, and I interviewed jazz musicians about their thinking process. So they played first, and then they listened to their own improvisations. And next slide. Then the question is, can you switch to the next slide? Yeah, I think. So the question is, what did I find and how did I get there? So one of the hard things about qualitative research is the question. So one of the things that I found, as you can see here, is that jazz musicians have this idea bank. They have, this collection of licks that they put in their improvisations. So here's my point. I was asking the musicians about their thinking process. If I had asked them, do you use licks in your improvisations? They would have probably all said, yes, of course I do, or I do, right? So I don't want to do that, right? Because by asking, are you using licks or ideas in your improvisations, I'm putting an idea in their head that flavors their responses. So my research would be biased. So what I did constantly through this is I simply asked, why did you play that? Where did that come from? And only if they said, well, as a matter of fact, I have this bank of ideas, and that's what I'm one of the things I'm using. So it's very important in qualitative research to think about the questions and how you can answer the questions unbiased. Here's an example from quantitative research. The next slide. So here I did a study, and all the references are at the bottom of the slides, so you can look up my research. So here I asked jazz musicians that were middle schoolers. Actually, they took a test to see if their involvement with jazz affected something called executive function. And then in the next slide, you will see that the improvisation group to the left scored better than the musicians group, which was students that had a band also, but didn't have improv. But so now, how can this be unbiased? And here in quantitative research, you have a long, long list of procedures. It's related to what we call statistics, and it's all about how do we know that the numbers actually show a clear difference, and how do we know that it's not just due to error, and it has to do with how large your sample sizes are, and how big the differences are in the means. But, you know, I have students that say, well, why can't I just take the average of the scores? But there's a lot more to it than that, and it has to do with bias. If you go to brain research, and this is the next one, next slide, the same applies. So I did a brain imaging study with jazz musicians, and it's published. But then I did a new analysis where I played around with brain imaging. So next slide. And look here, if I compare the thinking with jazz musicians, and I compare when they're improvising as opposed to playing something pre-learned, here's an image where it looked like there's a lot of deactivation, blue in the front of the brain. Well, the final slide, check this out. This is not what we published. So even in brain imaging, it all depends on how you set something called the threshold. And if you set it one way, you see one set of activations. And if you set it a different way, you see completely different sets of activations. So my point is, you have to really watch out. Whatever method you're using, think about how can you present results that you can be clear, unbiased. That will help you then make the point that what you are seeing is not just in your sample, but actually relates to a larger populations of the people that you are studying. So I'm going to stop right here, but I'll look forward to taking your questions later.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, applause, big applause. So continuing on that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Harry Price now from Kennesaw State. And Harry Price is one of the leading music ed researchers. For a long time, he was the editor of the Journal of Research in Music Education and many others, and has done a lot of this qualitative work and more. And Harry, are you ready to take it over?
Yep, I am. First, she's telling you I'm old. That's the first thing. Secondly, I want to thank Monika for organizing this and Martin for getting us underway. I'm going to say one thing though. I think that research also can be for replication or doing work that other people have done to see if you get the same results. So, but the key here is I just want to give you some general thoughts about doing research, because I actually don't think it's a hard thing, but I always think it's kind of fun. And so, so it's about how we think and how we approach things. So if you'll just move on to the next one. And so the key here is the question. And all of us, I really don't care what the question is. We're doing the research, you're doing the research. I think you need to decide what it is you're interested in, not, well, gee, I wonder what people want. I think it's what we want, because I do see this as a personal approach going on. And so we get the question, and we can examine anything in a lot of ways. And Martin already talked about qualitative, quantitative, numbers or whatever. But the key here is, what is the question you decide you want to look at? And then as you process it, that helps you dictate the direction you want to go. So if we move on, and so it's not the methodology, okay? That's not the approach. So what do you care about? And this is really personal to me. I love doing research. I'm a geek and I fully admit it. So what do you care about? Okay. So in that case, then what will you pursue? And where do your ideas come from? I mean, you can sit around and say, well, it came out of my head and we could just go from there. But research, as already been pointed to you, is not just that. I mean, yes, we have to have the ideas, but there's a way to go about this separate from writing for other styles or other approaches, or if you're writing for Billboard, that's a different animal than what we're talking about. So consider that and where it goes. Go on. the next slide. And so after you consider it, here's the deal. Have you done a thorough job of examination of the history, regardless of the approach? Or if you want to write a practice article, we kind of need to know what's happened before. Even if you're doing a historical paper, you don't just start out of, I'm going to write a paper on X. You need to learn the background. You need to study it, come at it from an informed approach. And so you got to set up your question and make it clear. Imagine, okay, I want to identify the best mouthpiece for a tenor saxophone. And that sounds great. And I'm thinking, really? What do you mean? Think about all the questions that alone creates. It's not as simple as it looks. We always have to keep getting smaller and smaller to get, if we're doing quantitative research. We need to understand all the problems that this creates, all the approaches. Are we talking, okay, just for tenor saxophones? Fine. Are we talking about this model, that model? Does the bore matter? Does the style matter? We're talking about jazz, you know, so we really, and it really frustrates, this really frustrates people, We need to be clear and small. And that's what kind of makes people nuts, because they think I'm going to answer the question for the world. And then you get down, really? I'm just going to answer this small thing. But the key here is we just keep adding things to it. We just keep building on it. And that's part of the idea of all research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. Next slide, please. So then what? So how are you going to go about it? What is the idea? Okay. And you need to make it clear. If somebody reads it, they want to know what you did. Okay. You may be duplicating what somebody did and you're doing it again. Let's say you did this, you read this great study and it was done with college kids, but you're thinking, but wait, that's really different than if I did this with middle school kids. Okay. Or you think it's great work and you're just going to extend it. You want to see if you get the same results. And that's part of the idea. So you tell us what you did and you do it, okay? When you're done, you tell us what you found. And that's kind of the key, okay? It's the so what. You get to the end and you move on and you try to be clear. So what's the deal? You figure out, okay, why did I look at this? What do I know? What's everybody else been doing? I'm building. Here's what I found. This is the information I want to share with people. And what does it mean? Okay, I found this. So given what everybody's done and what I've added to it, add that piece. Here's the meaning. And then we get to what people call projection, both qualitative, you know, okay, this is cool. Here are some problems with what I did, but here's some great stuff I found. I wonder if, and then we move forward. So it really is what's been done in the past. Here's the question I have. Here's my approach. Here's what I found and what is next. And that's kind of the key, you know, in a very simple and quick form, and hopefully clear enough that it makes sense to us, that we're able to do this kind of approach, this kind of movement, and that it makes sense to people who are reading our work. Okay, that's the key. And finally, on the next slide, the key here, part of what we want to do is we want to promote research, absolutely, and encourage you to apply to Jen, because the work that Monika and others are doing, and I'm on the board as well. And also, I do have to say, several of us talking here, we've been on boards of other journals or chaired other journals. So we kind of have an understanding of the things that need to be done and have done. And hopefully we can help people along the way, because that is part of the goal, at least for me, and I know my colleagues, is we want to help people succeed and continue supporting it. So that's just kind of an overview of the idea of when we're approaching research and, if we want to say, music ed research. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you, Harry. That is very, very helpful. And he helped me with my master's thesis at the time, so I can attest how helpful it is. I want to turn it over to Louise Porter now, who has taught many generations of jazz researchers at Rutgers University. And I'll stop sharing my screen for a minute. So Louise, go ahead and share yours. And
Thanks,
Share away.
Monica. Hello, friends, and hello, colleagues. So you should see a page there that says Jazz Index. And I want to start by saying both Harry and Martin, and Monica as well, of course, and John, have all done different kinds of research. Now, Martin and Harry are talking about research into the process of education, the nature of education, and Martin's even involved in stuff about how the mind works. The kind of research that I mostly have done over these years, when Monica says many generations, it makes it sound like I've been doing this since the era of Lincoln, but it's not quite that far back. But mostly what I do is research into jazz history, things that happened and how they should be understood, research into biography of jazz musicians, which of course is a kind of historical research, and music transcription and analysis. So there are certain resources that everybody needs to know about. And of course, I've been pounding these into the head of my students over the years, but for some reason, it's hard to get people to remember to always start here. And I'm sure Martin and Harry will agree that for many kinds of research, these resources would be helpful. One of the archives that John is going to mention later about archives, and there's a great archive in Darmstadt, Germany, directed by our friend Wolfram Knauer. And they have a service there, as you can see, it's called the Jazz Index. And the way that service works, I'm scrolling down and you'll see an email address here, jazz@jazzinstitute.de. And if you write to that email address, and in fact, the first time you write, they like to know how did you know about our service? So say, Lewis Porter bothered me until I finally decided to write. And they're very fast. What you do is you write them with up to 3 topics or persons that you'd like to see a bibliography on. It can be a jazz education topic. It can be an individual. It could be the word bebop. You know, they have a huge database of jazz periodicals, and you'll get something like this. You should be seeing this right now. It's a PDF, and they have it. It's a little bit of an untypical presentation because it's not alphabetical by author. It's a chronological. Here's the first article about Cecil Taylor's 1957. Then it goes all the way up to 2019, and they constantly are updating it. Do they have everything in this listed in the bibliography? No. And for one thing, they don't, as a rule, include academic journals. So you might not see the fine articles that are coming out in the journal that Monica's been talking about, but they certainly cover Downbeat, Jazz Times, etc. And I'm going to go back to the other page now to show you that they tell you themselves that they don't have everything. It says, we have indexed approximately 60% of our periodicals, as well as a great number of our books. But it's a great place to start. I mean, come on. Once you have that, then you can start adding to it. Now, what's the next thing? So that's great to start on your bibliography. Now, how about discography? Where are you going to find the recordings? Well, jazz fans actually were pioneers in discography. And some of the first discographies were actually put together by jazz fans in the 30s. And they still are fanatically putting things together. So luckily for us, there are resources. You will find as you surf around the web, there's a terrific Miles Davis discography. There's a very detailed Charlie Parker one. There are very detailed ones on Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Django Reinhardt. But a tradition in jazz going back to the 30s is to have a kind of a master list of all recordings. And the current one is by a fellow in Vancouver named Tom Lord. Now you should see up on your screen something that says Musicians Search. This is from his website, which is lorddisco.com, although he didn't want to repeat the letter D, so it's lorddisco.com. Or as my students sometimes accidentally refer to it, the Lord's discography. I didn't know the Lord was a jazz fan, but why not? You know, so you can put in the person that you're looking for. It could be anybody. Let's put in Elvin Jones. And when you search, oh, sorry, it's making me sign in, but I have that all set up. And when you search, it'll give you a listing from Elvin Jones's first recording in 1950 up to his last recording. There's a second page of this. You can cut and paste this into a Word document. You can do whatever you need to do. So again, do they have everything? Well, I'm a discographer myself, among other kinds of research. There are sometimes radio broadcasts and quite a few private recordings, even when you get into more recent years, audience recordings. There are tons of those. So do they have everything? No, but is it, again, a great place to start? 100% yes. Now, let's say that you have your bibliography from Darmstadt, and you're saying, well, it's great to have a list, but where am I going to find these magazines? Well, first of all, they have a service. They'll send you PDFs of articles, but they charge something, but it's really not much. I think you can get 10 articles for $20 US, something like that. So they will do it. If you're in the East Coast area, once things open up again, you can go to the Institute of Jazz Studies at the campus where I am Professor Emeritus, Rutgers in Newark. And right now there is a huge project though going on. First I should mention, of all the collections at the Institute of Jazz Studies, a lot of people don't realize the most complete and largest collection they have is jazz periodicals. They have every jazz periodical just about, from the first issue to the last or the current one. But there is a project right now which is called RIPM Jazz, which is, you can see here, ripmjazz.org. And they've, until things shut down, and they're going to go back to it though, they've been going through the Institute of Jazz Studies collection and digitizing. It's truly unbelievable. So you can look at Metronome magazine in 1934. Here's the Jazz Review. Here's 78 Quarterly. And you can put in a search thing. So for example, I put in Lee Morgan. Now, why did 1934 come up? If you know your jazz trumpet, you'll know that Lee Morgan was not in the jazz magazines in 1934. It came up because they found the word Lee and the word Morgan in that magazine. So, but you always get some false hits, so to speak. This is a fantastic resource. And the only thing about, I have to tell you about access, the Darmstadt bibliography is free. The Tom Lord discography is on a subscription basis, but for an individual, they first of all, they do have a free trial, I think it's 2 weeks, and they do have a $10 a month subscription rate for individuals, which, let's say you don't need it for the rest of your life. You're doing a project right now, you need it for a month or two. That's reasonable. And a lot of schools do subscribe. The RIPM is really for institutions. So if you're lucky, you'll be affiliated with a college or university that subscribes, or you'll bug them until they do. And I want to mention also that our good friend John Hasse put together a list of a number of jazz magazines that have their archives online for free. So there are a number of magazines that you can get access to, that anybody can get access to, which is great. And I also finally want to mention about newspapers. A lot of serious jazz history researchers will tell you that people are constantly browsing through Downbeat, but what they forget to go to newspapers. Quick example, in my Coltrane research, there was a concert listed in Downbeat. I found out by going through the newspaper, the concert had been canceled just after that issue of Downbeat came out. Now, you wouldn't know that unless you looked in the newspapers. So newspaper research for anything historical is very important. And there are databases of newspapers, again, that institutions subscribe to. The most frequent is New York Times, which does have a history of doing a lot of jazz coverage. The better resources are Black newspapers, because they always had like a jazz page. All the Black newspapers did. One of the most famous is Chicago Defender, And that's one that some institutions subscribe to. And I want to mention also public libraries. You don't have to be affiliated with an institution. Many public libraries, all of them subscribe to the New York Times database, and many of them subscribe to other newspaper databases as well. So those are a few tips if you're starting any kind of historically oriented research. These are things that everybody should know. Thanks.
Thank you, Louis. That's great, wonderful info and very useful. So much appreciated. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Again, that PowerPoint is available if you look in the Facebook comments. It's posted and you can access it. You could actually follow along right now. There is a list also in there of journals that John Hasse mainly put together. As you can see, some of the print journals, some of the online journals, and some of those back issues that you mentioned. So I want to turn it over to John Hasse, who, talking about newspaper writing, is currently writing some very informative pieces for the Washington Post still, and has been writing books and books. And if you wonder where Jazz Appreciation Month comes from, that was from the mastermind of John Hasse's desk. So John, fire away.
Thank you, Monica, and good afternoon to everybody watching this presentation. I'm going to start my clock for 5 minutes. Everybody's familiar with libraries. Fewer people are familiar with with archives in general. So I put a list together of 10 leading jazz archives, and I have to point out that the main difference between a library and an archives, a library generally collects published material, and archives collects unpublished material in the main. Now, there's many exceptions to that. But if you think of an archive as a place to go to find one-of-a-kind unpublished material, that's where there's just incredible amounts of gold for any researcher in jazz to uncover and use. The largest jazz archive in the world is the one that Louis has been discussing, Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers. The Smithsonian has the world's largest museum collection of jazz, including the enormous Duke Ellington collection, 200,000 pages of documents, including 100,000 pages of unpublished music that he and Billy Strayhorn wrote for the orchestra, and it's drawn researchers from all around the world. I've listed some other ones here. I don't want to go into too much detail. Let's go to the next slide here, please. And here are 3 leading jazz oral history collections, which have a lot of material online. This is particularly valuable at this time when so much is closed down. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Monika asked me to say a few words about the writing process, or at least the writing process that I found to be useful. Next slide. So I've come up with 16 points. Some of these are just incredibly obvious, some may not be. I think the place to always start is to determine your audience. Whom are you writing for? And then just determine your purpose and intended result. Always begin with the end in mind. Some people argue for outlining. I use bullet points, and I don't number them. I just put bullet points down and I reorder them. And it's really loosey-goosey at the beginning, but then it starts to take shape. Many writers find that it's important to write in the morning when they're fresh. In fact, your brain, while you're sleeping, is often processing solving problems. So if you get up in the morning, before reading the paper, before listening to the news, just start writing, and it may not be your best writing, but it'll be fresh. And writing and editing are really 2 separate pursuits. So the best thing is to write, set it aside, and come back later and edit. And I find that while writing is best in the morning, editing could be done later in the day or even in the evening. Set it aside, come back to it. Revise, 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 and revise some more. Read it aloud for rhythm and sound. You'll be surprised what you find with that. Next slide, please. I'd like to say, particularly if you're writing for people, if you're not writing for an academic journal, write as if you're explaining to someone outside your field. Have someone outside your field read it and give you feedback. I also argue that it's important to use a real, not an online dictionary. There's so much more detail. Same for thesauruses. And I'll point to two of those in the next slide, but let's not go there quite yet. And I would argue that for priorities, first you've got to write with clarity, because if it's not clear, nobody will get to your content. They won't understand it. And finally, with style. Avoid word echoes is something I've learned from writing quite a bit for the Wall Street Journal. They say, if I have the same word in the same paragraph, unless it's an ordinary word like, I don't know, jazz, find a synonym. Of course, it's important to avoid jargon, cliches, and buzzwords, such current buzzwords as optics, metrics, and what does it look like. Tighten the prose to eliminate any unnecessary words. Shorter is almost always better. And finally, proofread twice, once from the top, and then start at the bottom line, and proofread from the bottom up. Why? Because if you're reading from the top down, you're going to get into how the sentences flow, and you're going to kind of follow along the argument or the points you're making. But, aha, time's up. If you start from the end, then you're going to be more likely to spot misspelled words, typos, extraneous punctuation, and the like. These are some of the processes that I've found helpful. And next slide, please. And these, in my experience, are the two best thesauruses. Oxford American Writers Thesaurus is a kind of a starter thesaurus, but you'll get much more detail in the Roget's International Thesaurus. And final slide, please. And this is the best dictionary that I've found. The New Oxford American Dictionary, 3rd edition, has over 300,000 entries, far more than Collins or the other ones that most people have. So thank you for your attention. My 5 minutes are up.
Thank you so much, John. And I know there's so much more and so much more info, and it's hard to cram it in a few minutes. I'm hoping that if people have more questions, it's okay maybe to contact and ask specific questions for you in the future. And because, you know, there's no way to answer everything right now, but let's try a few. I have a long list of questions, and maybe we can touch on a few things before we have to go to future means. One that builds right on to what John just mentioned with the thesaurus and sources, and I'm hoping Harry and Martin might be the best to answer that one. Is there a book or an article on best practices in measurement for jazz research? You know, some consistent measurement approaches, rating scales, questionnaires across studies. So where would you send somebody to look for that?
Martin, are you answering this?
He's
you're pointing at me?
to you.
Well, look, I'm going to not give a very useful answer because quantitative research, it's really the best one for the question you're asking. There's no book that says if you do this, then do that. It's not like you just fill out a form. There's some standard measurements that we use, some standard analyses that we use. There's some software to do qualitative research that will outline aspects. So it really depends on the question you're asking and the approach you're using, which is not the answer people want. Maybe you know of a book that gives you, oh yeah, just answer these, you know, you just go to this test. I know of some that I've used and people use. My bet is Martin does as well, but it depends where you study, what the questions are, and there's a lot of duplication. I don't know, Martin, you agree on that, or am I being too simple?
Yeah, no, I completely agree on that. I would say the best thing to do is to find an article that is very close to what you are about to write and find out what they used as measurements. But the article, of course, has to be in a journal that you can really trust. So I'm going to plug the Journal of Research in Music Education, which is the one that Harry was an editor of for a while. It's difficult to get into, but when you find an article that does something similar to what you want to do, the chances that the method they use, the statistical methods, if you're doing quantitative, or watch out for this, sorry for the jargon, but the theoretical framework, which is kind of the lens through which you use and analyze qualitative research, right? So if you want to know, what's the standard? How is this kind of research done? If you can find an article in the Journal of Research and Music Education, you will have a guide for you right there that is specific to your question.
And there are two factors, obviously. You look at the quantity, you look at the data and probability, but you also need to note its impact. In other words, you may get a big difference, but then realize its impact is like 0.05. I mean, it doesn't matter. There's a difference between significant and important. So that's a whole nother issue, but you'll get all that if you read that journal and some others.
And may I say one other thing? For anybody in this that's watching this who are looking to publish in the Jazz Journal, in our new journal, the number one place to start is by getting the old one, is the one that's already out there, and read that very, very carefully to see what the style of writing and what has been accepted so far.
And to say where it's available, I just had a question on that. So in order to get to this journal, you can get your libraries, your school libraries, to subscribe to it. Just through the JSTOR site, find Jazz Education in Research and Practice, and ask your libraries to subscribe for it, so you have it available.
But Monika, you can also, as a Gen member, you can read the whole thing online, right?
Not yet. Soon. We'll figure this out. Working on it.
We're getting there.
Here is one actually that's probably for Luis and John mostly. What do you think? What are some areas of jazz research that have got the least attention so far?
That's a good one.
Good luck.
There are always individuals that people are astounded. Somebody just wrote me recently and said, Don Byas is one of the most famous jazz saxophone players of all time. And by the way, he was kind of amazing if you ever listened to him. And he said, where can I read about him? I said, honestly, there's not much. There's a couple of interviews. One of them's in French, which I happen to read French, but not all Americans do. And there are little biographical articles in the Jazz Encyclopedia. So there are a lot of holes in terms of research on individual musicians. That's one thing.
I would add, Louis, that the whole process of exporting American jazz to the rest of the world could use more study. The study of jazz in many countries has been not pursued nearly enough. And the whole business of jazz, which is a very complicated set of relationships, needs more study as well.
Just real quick, I'm reading a book right now by a fellow who just joined. I created this huge 900 members so far, a network of jazz folks. Martin, I think, aren't you a member of my group? I think so. And Harry, you should be.
I need to be.
Oh, okay. Anyway, this is fairly recent, but there's a fellow there named Dale Chapman that wrote a book called The Jazz Bubble. And it's interesting, this is an example of what people can be doing, John, because there are people who write about the jazz business and how jazz wasn't doing well in the 70s, and then Wynton Marsalis and a certain group started to do well with it in the 80s, but he ties it in with the larger economy instead of looking at it in such a narrow focus. And it's very persuasive. He's very knowledgeable, and he says it's not just because all of a sudden people liked Wynton. It ties in with all this stuff going on in the whole economy. So that's obviously a lot of work can be done there. I don't think I've seen exactly this kind of thing done before.
Right.
What group is this?
We'll talk about it later, but it's called
Okay.
jazz. It's a jazz professionals, teachers. A lot of players are joining now.
All right, we'll check later.
And any addition from other areas that?
Well, let me jump in and say, you know, I study the thinking behind jazz improvisation. And the reason that that's so hard to do is because we play, we listen to other people, and the brain has to put all that stuff together. And it's just very recently that there's even articles that are attempting to scan musicians while they play, and experimentally even to disentangle all those different processes, evaluating what you play according to what you hear, what other people say, what you see the audience. I mean, it's complicated, but it's happening, and it's common, but a true understanding is still years away.
I'm happy for you guys to correct me. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for one thing, Martin, everybody out there, they've been reading very old research, and they all say, well, that's my left brain. I do this with my right brain. Your research, among many others, shows it's not that simple. It's not like you cut this off and you turn that on, you know?
Correct.
And you guys feel free to correct me, but it's like music education, that research is developed and it's really hitting maturity. And so correct me if you wish, but I've always thought that jazz is needed, and I'm thrilled with this journal and the way things are going and the things that you've outlined that people do. But I think there's an incredible opening for most things, the key being what interests you as an individual. And then see if the work's been done, but tell me if I'm wrong, there are a lot of areas people haven't looked at, even though, just like you mentioned as an example, right? Here's this guy that nobody's looked at, but everybody thinks they have. So I actually think it's wide open based on the interest of the individuals. But if I'm wrong, you guys, have maybe a better handle on that. But that's my sense.
You're absolutely right, Harry. Absolutely.
I want to actually even push the boundaries. So I've done a lot of work using the jazz model, especially the jazz jam session, as a model for entrepreneurship and creative thinking. So, beyond inside jazz, there's a lot of potential on how this art form is a model for others. And of course, a lot of crossover in between. So as you said, the field is endless, and the main thing is to find what is your interest. What would you like to know more about, and explore that, and use what Harry presented earlier with asking the questions and finding that.
More research on the jazz audience would benefit pretty much the entire jazz community.
Absolutely.
True. So, I mean, this next question goes a little bit into that. Maybe we can just have a thought or two. What research conducted now do you believe could have the biggest impact on jazz advocacy and jazz education in public schools?
I actually think you just said it, John. I actually, if you understand your audiences, how to appeal to them, what is it they're interested in. In the other side, I mean, people have done research in orchestra, classical orchestra, and the audiences, what attracts them, what kind of literature is done, so forth. So I think, John, you just said it. You answered the question before it was asked, in my opinion, in terms of outreach and getting to audiences and helping develop those that are already there, just expanding on them. I mean,
well, especially now in the time of the pandemic, where, jazz musicians, finding audiences, reaching them is now more critical than ever.
I would jump in and say that there's some very exciting research out there that shows the benefits to kids that, learning to improvise is over and beyond beneficial to their thinking and their self-esteem. I looked at executive function, but there's other things out there that says, you learn to improvise, you become more creative, you can be, the fact that you can solve this puzzle of creating music in the moment that fits this, where there are these structural boundaries, right? Like, the fact that you can play in a chord progression if you're talking tonal or even non-tonal, that you can fit in a certain context, I think is incredibly beneficial to kids. And I've worked with a lot of advanced players, and I'm myself a string player, and very advanced string players, that's never improvised. They say, "Oh, I can't do it. I can't do it." And then after about half an hour of a couple of exercises, call and response, something, it's like they're like the light comes on, and they're like, "My goodness, I didn't know I could do that." And I think to have all the kids out there that are in a concert band, that are in orchestra, that are in choir, that do not improvise, to have them experience this freedom of improvising, I think is very important. And there's research out there that are documenting that.
And that fits well with the requirements of music educators.
Well,
that is the requirements.
Yeah.
That fits.
Often overlooked. I know it's one of Jamie Aebersold's pet peeves, actually, that he says it has to be in every music education program that you take improvisation and the basics, because if you're afraid of doing it, you can't teach it later on if you're in front of a jazz band, and you will be.
I'm always saying that classical folks need to have more background in improvisation. Of course, historically there was, but it's kind of dropped by the only ones who are required now are the organists. I don't know if you know this, but classical organists are required to take improvisation, but nobody else is. And just to reinforce what Martin is saying, absolutely, because the research not only shows that the improvisation is exciting for them, but that the intellectual stimulation carries over into other fields.
So actually, and we can broaden this a little bit more. Somebody is curious about further grant resources, and maybe we can help from whatever we know. But this one specifically is asking for grant sources to start an archive like Rutgers. How do you start? Is there any support? And maybe we can broaden it. What other grant resources might there be available if you want to do work in various areas? Maybe you can share anything you're aware of.
Starting an archive is one thing. Sustaining it is a much bigger challenge. And I would just caution anybody wanting to start an archive. Think 30, 50, 100 years down the road. Who's going to sustain it? Who's going to support it? What happens if the institution that encompasses it has a change of dean or president or something, and isn't so interested? This happened a few years ago at the University of Idaho. What then? So I would argue that it's the existing archives need support. In general, it's much better to add to the material in one of those archives than to start a new one. But if one is starting a new one, the ideal thing would be an endowment to make sure it can keep going in fair weather and bad weather. Very hard to raise an endowment, especially now.
And that's exactly what you would say about starting journals. It's the same. It's a lifelong and beyond.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter what it is that you're starting. You got to think beyond yourself and your personal interest, which is your point.
And there's additional factors for an archive, of course: climate control, preservation, access. It's really complicated.
There is some preservation grants through the NEH and the NEA. We have some grants here at Indiana University for digital preservation. So there's options to dig into those foundation and grant resource databases and find some things. But as you mentioned, it's about sustainability also.
I think John's point is it's not so much about, those grants aren't so much for starting an archive. I mean, they're going to say where is it going to be? How, all those questions. But those are grants for particular projects. I have a former grad student, Michael Heller, who kind of specializes in the collections of avant-garde jazz musicians. And he has gotten grants to digitize them and organize them, but that's because they're going into a particular archive that's already lined up to receive it.
Right.
So many are asking what we can do at this moment to keep jazz relevant. And since we're talking about research, what kind of actions, directions can we do to keep it vital, move it forward? Any thoughts?
Move the music forward or move the state of knowledge and the research forward?
Well, the question comes from the music, the art form.
It's moving. There's no way you're going to stop it. So, as far as the
I was kind of laughing at that. Go ahead, finish, because I want to add something.
That's it. As far as, I mean, I play piano in free jazz situations, playing standards, big concert halls and little restaurants and bars, and you know, it's moving. It's moving.
You know how many times they've said the orchestras are finished? Okay, back to the 1800s. Every time a new development came, including the harmonium, all of those. So I'm with you. I don't think that's the issue. I think live music, I really do believe live music matters and we enjoy it. And but maybe think it's dying. I don't know. I have my opinions about classical music as well, but jazz, man, it's contemporary. It's happening, and it's happening in so many different ways. You guys, I don't see it as that. Like you said, I don't see it as an issue.
Let me jump in and say, and I'm going to jump on something that Harry said a little while back, a couple of minutes ago, where he says, well, you know, the improvisation is in the national standards, and so to me, that coming from music education, the power is every time you have a fifth grader that puts on Coltrane for the first time, and it's like, wait a minute, I can't believe this guy, you know, and you know, that's what's going to keep this music going, because that person is then going to say, well, you know, what's happening now? Where can I go and hear it? You know, who's doing it now? And so hopefully we have both the history going forward, and you know, knowledge of the greats plus you know, encouragement for new players. But one thing about that's so funny to me about the national standards. So in national standards is this thing that it came out of the National Association for Music Education. Had a different name in '92, but that's not important. But what's funny to me is, you know, so back in '92 and even earlier, there was talk of, you know, we need to get improvisation into the curriculum, right? So now we're talking about, well, why is improvisation not really in the curriculum, even though it's been in the standards? And then there's still a lot of teachers, you know, that don't do it, and they may do it, you know, orchestra teachers, they may do it at the very, you know, last week of the year, but, you know, for the concert, for the, you know, adjudicated concert, there's no improv. Now, imagine if we were in computer science and something came into our national standards in 1992 and we still haven't gotten around to actually teaching it, right? Computer science in 1992, you know, there's things that came and went and came and went and came and went. So, I mean, the music education community is behind in really, truly incorporating improvisation into everything they do. Everything they do. And every kid needs to leave, you know, whatever ensemble it is, if it's an orchestra, it's a concert band, they need to leave that ensemble and improvise in jazz style, in classical style. But I think, and once that starts happening, and it is happening to some extent, it really is. But once that starts happening, those kids are going to go back into the history and find the greats, and they're going to go out and they're going to say, okay, who can I listen to right now? So they will support both sides.
Thanks, Martin. So we're getting to the end. Just a few things to wrap it up. Deanna Witkowski was asking if there's room for historical articles. She does a lot on Mary Lou Williams. So yes, Deanna, there's lots of room for that's very important. And the idea of role models in learning is crucial. We learn from history, so please do submit on that. We had a question from Dave Copeland that's interesting. He's looking into interviewing family members of jazz musicians and record label owners. And he was looking for the best database to find people where he could gather that information. Do you have any suggestions?
I don't understand the question. Record label owners and families of jazz musicians, that's not, usually not the same thing, but what's the...
I think, you know, I know he did some research on Blue Note records and all that. So I think it's digging into more just specific history of Blue Note and recordings and recollections on that.
Of particular labels? Well, there's a lot of resources for that. I mean, it's funny, I don't know about my colleagues here, but for some reason over the years, I've met most of the producers as well as the musicians and the educators. You know, that's a whole community, but there's plenty of people still around for all those labels. The labels, if the label is still, a label like Blue Note that's still around has their files going back to the beginning. There are labels that no longer exist, but sometimes a larger label has bought their files. And, but the kind of thing, this group that I started called Jazz Studies Collaborative is the name. Sometimes it's great just to put your question out there with a lot of people, and invariably you find somebody, if it's a label that no longer exists or a musician who's passed away, they go, oh, well, I'm in touch with his widow, or I know her late husband, I know her late husband's family, you know, or I know that they donated their materials to such and such of an archive, you know, so there are ways to do that, absolutely.
And if the musician is still alive, you might get a hold, or the person doing the inquiry might get hold of someone who's in the local 802 AFFM in New York City, ask them to look that musician up in the union directory, and that's a quick way of doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, it's actually something I love often about research. It's like detective work, you know, you're you're drilling in and you're finding pieces and pieces here and you're putting it together. It's like, yeah, being a detective.
That's the part I love about it. I love that aspect.
I know.
You can't really plan it. You can't say, well, I'm going to do it for 6 months and then I'll know everything, because on the last day, somebody emails you and says, do you know about this? I go, oh, gee, I had no idea. And then starts you off on something else. Yep.
And talking about that, there's one more question that asks to clarify what actually is a case study in comparison to others. Maybe some of you researchers could help with that.
You gonna do it, Martin?
You go ahead.
Oh, what is this? Oh. All right, case studies is all right. I mean, there's a broad range from qualitative to quantitative. A case study is you take one person or a few people and you study them deeply. I had a colleague, or actually former student, and she did a study of a youth choir and the directors and the kids and what it meant to them. In other words, it's a very deep look at one specific thing or one aspect. That's a case, a single case. And you also make the point, I'm not trying to generalize to the world. This is this one. What we learned from this one case, this one instance, may inform other things, but I can tell you about this one case, this one situation. That's what a case study is. Is that clear enough for folks?
Probably.
And, you know, I think we covered most of the essential details here, and a lot. The slides that are available here on links at the Facebook Live, and they will be archived with this also. They have links to immense amount of materials and all the questions answered. And I'm sure if, Louis, it's the Jazz Studies Collective, right?
Collaborative.
Collaborative.
For professionals who are involved in jazz in just about any way. So I guess if people are interested, they can reach out to me. I have a website, louisporter.com. I'm not hiding. My home phone is there. My email is there. So, you know.
Monica?
Yes.
Since we're drawing to a close, I hope that we can encourage everybody watching this feed to attend the GEN conference next January. It's such a great opportunity to learn, to mix with professional musicians. You can sit down with Branford Marsalis or Wycliffe Gordon or Candido Camero and just chat with them. They're very approachable. It's the best jazz hang in the world, and I think people ought to attend and join the conference.
Well, and applications for presentations are still open.
Right.
So right now till the end of the month, if you want to present, if you want to perform, if you want to share a clinic, it's all open. Submissions to the journal are extended for 2 more weeks. Do a quick write, but it's open till May 18. Some were asking if they had a dissertation. Can I submit an article about that? Yes, please. That's exactly what it is for, because often graduate students put all this work into writing these immense dissertations, and then they sit in a library. So please share with the public and summarize your findings, put them in an article, and that's your way for starting your academic career too, your way of getting all these tenure credentials eventually, and even just to get feedback, you know, something in that peer-reviewed process. You might not get immediately, yes, let's publish it, but you might get a lot of feedback. You should revise here, or you might even get a no and say, this is not ready yet for publication. But that's an amazing learning experience to get that and go back and say, here's this input from the experts and it's invaluable. How can I learn and make it better? So please do that, and do consider also submitting a project to the fellowship. We would love to have all kinds of great projects that can be presented at the conference and published eventually in the journal. So lots of great opportunities.
I just want to jump in, Monica. There's one resource that hasn't been mentioned, which is the Weimar Jazz Database. If there's anybody out there that are interested in studying particular licks and how they have developed, you can go into their website and you can put in +2, +2, +1, +5, and it spits out all the instances in their database where that lick has been played, and it will play it for you. It'll play a little bit of the recordings, and you will see the notation. So if anybody into that kind of research, which is formally called corpus research, that's an amazing database, and I will email you the link if you don't have it, and we'll put it up.
I think they have about 300 transcribed solos in there now, and hopefully adding to that.
It's close to 500, but they are starting a second database.
Okay.
So there's a whole different additional project. So they're using what's called Music Information Retrieval, MIR, to automatically now transcribe jazz solos, which means that it also has volume information, so it's more accurate than MIDI. And anyway, it's amazing what they're doing.
Great, great.
One other thought about the Ella Fitzgerald Foundation GEN Research Fellowship at the Smithsonian. I've been reviewing those proposals every year, and some proposals have made the mistake of not having a good fit between their topic and the archival resources at the Smithsonian. The fellowship exists to maximize those resources. So it's important to find out about those resources and make your proposal have a good fit. And if you have any questions, feel free to write me.
All great ideas. So I think we shared a lot of wisdom and a lot of, and I hope people are inspired. You know, research shouldn't be something to be afraid of, which often people are. They think, oh yeah, it's this thing, I have to go in a dark corner and be by myself and do things and write in a way that nobody understands. And that's not the case. That's why we call it in research and practice. This is just a gathering of information that helps all of us to do better what we do. So go do it submit to all of this. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and sharing. And I'm not sure how this is going to end, but I'm assuming Jen will hit a button. We'll just wave goodbye. Thank you. Applause, applause, applause.
Take care.
Thank you, Monika.